I really appreciate Eric and Molly for providing our music today. It's amazing. So I want to tell just a small story about voting that in a conversation I had just a couple of weeks ago. There's a friend of mine whose name is Rabbi Bernie Gerson of Congregation Rodef Shalom in Denver, and he serves with me on a statewide clergy caucus for Together Colorado, along with Reverend Lydia Ferrante Roseberry of the Boulder Valley Unitarian Universalist Church in Lafayette. Together Colorado, as I've mentioned before, is an interfaith community organizing coalition that works on racial justice, criminal justice reform, mental health, health care, poverty, and many other issues. Bernie, Lydia, and I recently had this conversation about what our traditions have to offer to support those in imagining justice and beloved community. What do we have to support those who imagine with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King that everyone, no matter their race or ethnicity, would love, serve, and appreciate, not just tolerate, but appreciate one another? Reverend Lydia mused that even though Unitarian Universalists believe in a profound interconnection with one another based on our first and seventh principles, we also have a severe streak of individualism that can lead to arrogance. And even our stated support for democracy, which is in our fifth principle, can turn into my vote counts instead of our votes count. Rabbi Bernie sat back a bit, as he tends to do, and said that within the Jewish tradition, there's also a lot of individualism that comes out in the form of having lots of arguments. You just can't leave because you disagree if you're in the Jewish tradition. But these arguments make the fabric of give and take stronger, he said, because with everyone's input, no matter how contentious or divergent, everyone also begins to see together a closer vision of what God might see, the whole picture, with everyone's voice counting. There's also an understanding in the give and take that whatever I may believe, my views will be enriched by reflections from someone who disagrees. God, or the mystery of life, sees a whole picture of humanity and its possibility. We each can only carry our own particular visions, but together with all our voices, we can weave that larger vision. And we may begin to see our world draw closer to what Rabbi Bernie believes God wants or sees, which is the meaning of shalom, real peace in the Jewish tradition. Within this larger vision, I believe, is what our Unitarian Universalist faith has to offer those whose backs are up against the wall, those whose voices are not heard. For they are also a part of our vision of radical inclusiveness, which may lead to individualism through many voices, but it doesn't have to lead to isolationism. We don't have to separate into camps. We can still disagree and care for others and stay together, especially if we can keep our desire for inclusiveness embedded within the creation of covenanted community. Now, we know when we say radical inclusiveness, we mean those who want to walk with us toward a better world, those who are seeking the good in their life and values and want to raise their children with ethics. So this is not a mind game. This is not semantics. This is real, wanting to create the genuine covenanted community. Our ideal of this community comes primarily from the Jewish tradition, too. It is our way of describing how we can remain whole and together, even with all our differences. Covenanted community, in other words, is our concrete, here and now way of describing Bernie's mosaic vision of the whole from God's view. Learning to genuinely appreciate differences can lead us to love instead of separation, if we can hold close our covenant. Now, I didn't actually say all of those words when I was with my colleagues, but what I came to clearly see as I thought about our conversation is that isolationism and individualism are on one side of that coin when we work to create radically inclusive community through those covenanted relationships. Now, you can choose the side of coin that you want, of course. But the higher ideals of community, including the ideal of a democratic country, call us to radical acceptance, not to division and polarized either-or positions and beliefs. There should be room here, in this community, for wide and diverging opinions, representatives of all the political parties, followers and believers from all kinds of traditions, because we are seeking the whole, whether it is the whole picture through the eyes of God or through the formation of beloved community. It is not easy. In fact, it can be terribly hard. But if we can learn to listen as much as we exclaim, we will create from all that noise a whole community, and we will all be the wiser for it. I often say that there is no more difficult year for our churches than presidential election years. And this one is a doozy. It has brought into focus deep divisions in our culture. I am trying to breathe and believe and hope that things will indeed work out, even though so many powerful buttons are being pushed within many of us. But all of those buttons are pieces of the whole story, and many stories need to be told to understand why people may feel so differently about important issues. Simply voting and electing next year's officials will not change those divides, nor will anyone be able to accomplish all they promise or what they see as their vision for our country. We must come to understand that we must keep trying over and over, revealing over and over again why there are so many failures, where our system is flawed, even broken, and how we each add our voice to a better democracy. Democracy, beloved community, and covenant are all part of a vision that would lead to a better world. And we each must remember that we have a voice and a vote, which we can use to express our own thoughts, which can bring us a tiny bit closer to the wholeness we seek. So take advantage of your opportunity to express yourself in November, and know that it matters, no matter what happens, because it is an expression of a spiritual belief in something greater than ourselves. You have cards in your order of service today that are from Together Colorado that ask that you say you will vote, and that you also will vote yes on T. Amendment T would take out an exception which allows slavery and indentured servitude in our Colorado Constitution, which is an echo of the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which most of us have probably thought completely abolished slavery under any circumstance. However, the 13th Amendment and our Constitution read, in part, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist. Clearly, I hope you can see that this exception bespeaks of the fear that existed of the newly freed slaves after the Civil War, and it shouldn't be in our constitutions. The work of creating a truly free country has been unbelievably hard, and we're not there yet. For example, we also gave black men the right to vote, or any race of men, in the 15th Amendment in 1869. But the shift in our culture for all men to vote didn't really occur until 100 years later, when the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act were passed. And no woman had the right to vote until 1919, when Congress passed the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920. I hope you feel that spirit that caused all those great changes, and that you understand that voting is an incredible privilege, and when we do it, we are participating in an ongoing march towards something better. Every vote, every step gets us closer and closer to the sacred vision of a whole and free humanity. Amen. And now Kenny will finish the sermon.
All right, so at the end of the 2012, the third presidential debate, the moderator from CBS, Bob Schieffer, ended the debate broadcast by quoting his mother, who said, "Go vote, it'll make you feel big and strong." And I loved that because the first time I voted was in an election was 2006. I was 18 and I was voting in Texas. And when I went with my parents, and it was an incredibly meaningful experience. So I know we've got some math folks in the house. Mark, I know. So I know, Andrew, you probably can help us out a little bit. So my grandmother was born in January of 1919 and is still alive. So could anyone tell me how old my grandmother is now? Gio? 100. That's almost correct, not quite. So not 103, other direction. All right, Janet, help us out. 97. Yes, Andrew, I know you had it too. So my grandmother is 97 years old, and she grew up in small town Arkansas. So as Jan laid out for us, white women got the right to vote in 1920. So how old was my grandmother? My grandmother's a black woman. How old was my grandmother when white women got the right to vote in 1920? This one should be easy. Josiah, you got it? You're telling me. Okay, 1, right? So I asked my dad, it's my dad's mother, and I asked my dad, do you know what the first election my grandmother would have voted in? So if you're 18, in a world that she should have grown up in, so when you're 18, you can vote, or when you're I'm sorry, back then it was 21. So how old could she, what was the election she could have voted in if the laws were fair? So she's born in 1919, 1940. Does anyone know who was president in 1940? FDR, yeah, we got some, I love this. Okay, so I promise this all, we're going somewhere. So the first election my grandmother voted in was in 1960. Can anyone tell me who the candidates were for president in 1960? Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, and Richard Nixon, yes. So how old was my grandmother? She was born in 1919. The first election she was able to vote in was in 1960. She was 41. And she lived in Arkansas, which allowed blacks to vote a few years before states like Mississippi and Alabama did, which was in 1965. So that's why I vote, and that's why I have this t-shirt. Voting is one way to change systems, to make the change we want. It's not the only way, and many of you know I'm an activist, and I live that out through organizing and protest and all sorts of things. But I vote because there are a lot of folks who worked hard to make it a reality that my grandmother, who should have been able to vote in 1940, to make it so that she could vote and so that her sons could vote and that her grandchildren could vote. And that's why I vote. And so I know for many of us, we have our different reasons for voting, but I ask us to go deep. Maybe it's a story in your own family. Maybe you're inspired by the history of the civil rights movement or by the history of women's suffrage. Because the right to vote has been among the hardest earned rights in our society and in our country. And so when I go vote, it's one person, it's one ballot, but I carry my grandmother, who isn't really able to function very well anymore, but I carry her with me into the ballot box. And I carry my parents with me, and I carry their parents and grandparents, and I carry the history of women's suffrage and the history of civil rights. And so again, I ask you, go deep. Why do you vote? If you're under 18, why will you vote? What will your reason? Looking right at Josiah. Why will you vote? You don't have to have an answer today, but Josiah will think about it. Excellent. But I think that as Unitarian Universalists, there's so many ways for us to make change, and this is one way. And this is why I vote. Thank you.